Last week, everyone logged onto their YouTube accounts and subscribed to my channel, correct? No? Okay. But just prior to that, we held a pure democratic vote, no superdelegates in this convention, on what topic to cover, extending off of last week's Babel lesson, and the majority of the votes said we want to hear about the historicity, evidence outside of the Bible that corroborates the biblical story. So, today, outline is as such. We're going to cover Nimrod's profile with the majority of the time. Then we'll get back into dating the actual Babel event using Old Testament chronology. Then we'll use that information to go out and find a secular counterpoint or counterpoints to the biblical narrative. So let's get right into it with Nimrod's profile, starting with that in chapter 11's story, there are 7 archaeological and sociological elements to the story. Since the Bible claims that humanity was universally collected together in the general Mesopotamian area before God dispersed them across the entire earth, is that you would really suspect that some point after all that happens, that other cultures would retain that memory and convey it to their own cultures down through time. We also know that in Genesis 10 that it spoke on the division of the nations. This is in reference to the Tower of Babel. Another element is that when you count the number of nations in each line, is that their grand total was 70. The numbers weren't accident, as we saw last Sunday either. Now, seeing that chapter 10 is speaking on the Babel division, is that sandwiched in between these verses is 10:25 statement that in the days of Peleg that the earth was divided. This interruption in the text is deliberate by Moses and should be seen as the when did Babel occur in the biblical history. This is repeated in 1 Chronicles 1:19 when it repeats the Genesis genealogy list. The division dovetails right into chapter 11's opening verse that the whole earth had one language before Babel. This is solidified in Psalm 55 when David asked God to divide, Peleg, his enemies' tongues. So if you were constructing a timeline off of chapter 5's and 11's genealogies in Genesis, is that this is what you would have with Peleg at number 15 from Adam. I am placing Babel roughly here for right now. As chapter 10 went one generation more past Peleg, with his brother Joktan's 13 sons being listed in the 70 nations list in chapter 10. This would make the Babel story be approximately 250 years before Abram's call, which is definitely enough time for the whole world to fall into deep paganism, and which is very apparent by Abraham's time once you get to Genesis 12. But geez, Noah and Shem are still around. How could things fall apart this fast after the flood, right? I would say that it happened even sooner. As my most viral video on the channel, of course it's one of the obscure topics, but it is what it is Genesis 9's story on Ham's sin against his father Noah. Ham's sin at the end of the day was a usurping attempt by him against his dad to become the main patriarch over basically the entire world. Interesting and connectable points within here to Babel is 9:19's reference to the whole earth being overspread by Noah's 3 sons. The word can also mean scattered, not just in terms of population. Ham's sin resulted in his 4th son, Canaan, being cursed, which always gets into the debate in the comment section of, well, why did he get cursed and not Ham if Ham was the one who committed the sin? Well, for the sake of all the children in here, basically, is that if you want to know that answer, just go watch the video. It's not for the youngins' ears in here. But this didn't mean that Ham was immune, as Noah calling him the younger son was not in reference to him being the youngest chronologically, but speaking prophetically, calling him and his descendants small in number and insignificant compared to his brothers' lines, Japheth and Shem. 9:26 and 27 has Noah blessing the Lord God of Shem and says that Japheth's line would be enlarged, which is an allusion to population and wealth. Genealogically, Shem's line is the messianic line that runs through Peleg to the patriarchs, to David, and then ultimately to Jesus in Luke 3. The number 77 is intentional by Luke. And always remember, Paul is likely in his ear throughout this. 7 is the number of divine completeness, and multiples of it intensify what is being conveyed. The only other time 77 comes up in the Bible is with evil Lamech in Genesis 4:24, when he says, I'll take out 77-fold vengeance on those who come against me if Cain's vengeance is sevenfold. So Jesus, being the 77th in the line, is conveying an intensified message of divine mercy and grace. 70 has been our main number, and it's not coincidental that Jesus sent out the 70 in Luke 10. And when they returned, they said even the devils were subject under his name. This is reclaiming the nation's language back from the gods of Deuteronomy 32:8 and 9. I show these types of things to highlight how the redemptive plan is basically, it's stitched throughout the entire Bible by all the numerous authors. Going back to Genesis 9:27 is that Noah proclaims Japheth will dwell in the tents of Shem. Something we'll circle right back to at the very end. But also he repeats, Canaan's curse, Ham's son, will have him being a servant unto both Shem's and Japheth's descendants. So shortly after the flood, we have rebellion already at work with Noah's son Ham. This ends chapter 9, which segues right into chapter 10 and 11, which is the division of the nations. This is deliberate. They are literally connected to one another by Moses. So when the ancient Israelite, and now us too in the modern day, read Genesis 10:6's line of Ham, is that you know that this line is basically a line that is, for the most part, in opposition to God. Not 100%. Uriah the Hittite falls under this category. Uriah was the most faithful man to David, and ultimately David backstabs him. And in typical Moses fashion is that he goes down a line of descendants and occasionally stops to highlight certain ones with additional comments, which indicates there's something special that Moses wants us to know about Nimrod when he breaks away in the text. Verses 8 and 10 say that he, Nimrod, began to be a mighty one on the earth. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord, wherefore it is said, even as Nimrod, the mighty hunter before the Lord. And the beginning of his kingdom was Babel, and Erech, Akkad, Calneh, in the land of Shinar. The language clearly connects Nimrod to the Tower of Babel. Both accounts say the city of Babel started in the plain of Shinar, so it's safe to say that Nimrod was the leader of the rebellion against God. Even Nimrod's name is connected, as in Hebrew it means let us rebel. The prefix let us should make you think of 11:4's statements of let us build, let us make, and unless we be scattered, that all contain the same Hebrew stem in front of each word. On the Genesis timeline is that it says in the days of Peleg that the division occurred. So we can for now generally cover his whole lifespan as a potential of when Babel occurred. Then, keeping in mind that Nimrod was the grandson of Ham, and simply overlaying them on the same generation is that you have the following. Did they live as long as the ones that are listed in Genesis 11? You don't know. It's not stated. But we're just doing it for the sake of purposes here. Then adding in the siring age for each generation is that we can approximate that Nimrod was about 50 to 60 years old when the Babel event first possibly occurred. Narrowing the window down for Babel comes with the understanding that Peleg's brother, like I said, Joktan, had 13 sons already at the dispersion. And I would say that they are being credited for founding a nation. Therefore, they should be seen not as little kids, but as grown-ups more. So you can safely say that the next generation of kids were born at the time of the tower being erected. So this stretches our window of around 70 years out when the Babel event occurred in. It's pretty crazy if you look at the chart here. Is that at the very top? Who's still alive? Noah, and a few of his kids, of course. But once again, Noah is watching all of humanity rebel against God. Probably just shaking his head a lot. Now, the other statements on Nimrod is that he is called mighty 3 times in Genesis, and it's reiterated in 1 Chronicles as well. The Hebrew word here is Gabor, which is the word when we say we serve a mighty God. It's the same one. Or Jesus in 9:6 prophetically called, he will be called the mighty God. What's interesting is that the first time Moses used this word was in Genesis 6:4, describing the Nephilim giants that came from the sons of God. He also called them men of renown. That is, famous men. They were men looking for a name. Their names were famous, and what did happen at Babel? Let us make a name for ourselves. Notice that Moses said the giants were in the land after the flood too. Moses refers to the Nephilim again in Numbers 13, with them being in the promised land. And that wasn't a false report. It was just that most of them were all chicken except for Joshua and Caleb. And they said that they were tall and some descended from Anak, who does not have a direct line up to anyone. So we don't know exactly where that started with him. And if one goes tracking down other giant verses in the Old Testament, is that the words Rephaim, Anakim, and Nephilim would be seen as being synonymous with one another. Og of Bashan has a bed that was described as being 12 foot long, made of pure iron to support him. Was a Rephaim, and Goliath was as well. This line of thinking has some proposing that Nimrod was a giant himself. The main problem with that idea is that Cush, Noah's grandson that is, and there's no element that God would allow anything with the Nephilim being on the ark through the flood. So the whole point of the flood, if you're to get asked by people like, why would God send out a flood? Yes, humanity was totally depraved at the time. Yes, that's a big component to it. But a very large component is we got to wipe out the giants in the land. And that's part of God's mission to Joshua is get in the land and clean them out. Did they totally do it? Nope. Ultimately leads to David taking down Goliath. So the whole proposal is wrong that Nimrod is a giant. He's just super sinful like a lot of them. Evil, famous men dominating the world, which is meant by the statement that Nimrod was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Hunter, in Moses' use outside of here, is used in actual hunting of animals, like with Esau. But if you go looking for it in the rest of the Old Testament, is that it can refer to hunting down people. And when you combine the definition of his name with the phrase in the context of the tower, is that you have someone leading another human rebellion against God. It's a lot just to jam into a name in a couple verses, huh? The fall, the flood, and Babel are 3 whole humanity rebellions against God before he calls Abram. So collectively, we are looking for a notable figure, a king who not just built Babel and the tower, but also other cities like Erech, Akkad, and Calneh. The last piece of debate on Nimrod is the verse that follows the statement that he built 4 cities in the land of Shinar. Verses 11 and 12 say that out of the land, that is Shinar, went forth Asher and built Nineveh, Rehoboth, Calah, and Rezin. The peculiar piece here is that Asher is a descendant of Shem, not Ham like Nimrod, and isn't mentioned until verse 22. That doesn't mean necessarily it couldn't be him. But as of right now, this is option 1 for a translation, which is the KJV, NASB, Josephus, and a Targum. Option 2, which is basically the most modern versions hold to, and the Hebrew can support, is treating the word Asher not as the subject, but as the object, which keeps Nimrod as the subject, going forth and building Nineveh and 3 more cities. This basically is the route that modern translations take, and this has verses 11 and 12 telling us what happened after God scattered the people, which would include Nimrod getting kicked out of Babel himself. Nimrod might have a confused language to others right now, but his personality hasn't changed, and building cities didn't stop at Babel either. The last time that name Nimrod is used in the Bible is in Micah 5:6, and it's called referring to the Babylonian area, the land of Nimrod, which makes sense if Micah's time prophesying comes 100 years before the Babylonian Empire comes to power. Calling the Mesopotamian area the land of Assyria and Nimrod leans more favorably to option 2 in the translations, that Nimrod was the one who also built Nineveh and those other cities. This textually has both accounts paralleling each other for chapter 10 and 11 of the Babel descriptions.
At this point in the video, if you haven't subscribed already, and the analytics say that roughly 77% of you haven't, go down and hit that free subscribe button. This is the kind of deep dive, scripture-rich content that you're going to get out of every video that I put forward. No milk here, just meat.
Now, we move on to the dating of the Babel incident. I know there's a lot to be firehosed here with. Chronology in itself is the weediest topic you can stick your head into. And my head has been stuck in the muck and the mud of this for a lot of years. If you're just trying to dabble yourself, these are 4 great resources. Start with the first 2. These are more articles. The first 2 are a lot more digestible and laid out for easy eye reading. So I have recently covered a lot on chronology surrounding the land Sabbaths, dating them. And every 6 years, in the 7th year, the land was supposed to rest in ancient Israel. Eventually, that becomes the exile period because they didn't follow the rule. So can we date those things? If you go watch those 2 videos, yes, you can. And the other thing is you kind of see how the weeds of biblical chronology work. I'm not taking you through all that. Long story short is that for the kingdom period is our starting point, and there's 4 events that if you can memorize them and the dates, you can snap everything from 1 Samuel on through the rest of the Old Testament into your head where it approximately falls. So the reigns of the kings is the hardest part in reconciling biblical chronology. When they say this king started in that year's king's first year and he reigned this long and back and forth and back and forth, it's not straightforward. You have to know how chronology worked in the ancient Near World. The importance of that date is that it allows us to date the Exodus. That is the division of the kingdom in 931. Because we can also date the Jordan crossing after we know about the Exodus, since 1 Kings 6:1 says that in the 480th year after the Exodus, Solomon's 4th year, are being synced together. And that's when he started building the first temple. So, taking that statement that Solomon's 4th year overlaps 968 to 967, and then the 480th year of the Exodus runs from the spring of 967 to the spring of 966. This is just a little dabble of chronology. So if you're already confused, I get it. The Exodus, it's Passover, begins in the spring to spring. King's rules, reigning years, ran from fall to fall, Tishri to Tishri, the 7th month, basically September, October-ish for us. Then we add in 1 Kings' statement that it was the 2nd month in which the temple began being constructed, is that you can see this started to be going down in about April of 967 BC. So, to calculate the date of the Exodus, is that we add 479 complete years onto 967, and we arrive at 1446 BC for the Exodus. I cannot diverge off and tell you who the Pharaoh is, but you got your date. If you want to go hunt it down, go for it, and you can see why is there 3 different lists for the Egyptian pharaohs. Yeah, that's part of that whole chronology discussion. And calculating the crossing of the Jordan is pretty simple because all you have to do is add on 40 years for the wilderness wandering, and you get 1406 BC for when the Israelites entered the Promised Land. Broadly, this is how biblical chronology looks on a complete timeline up until the point of Jesus' birth. And you see who the main opponent, the empire that Israel was dealing with throughout the course of history. The very bottom there is how archaeologists refer to different time periods: Middle Bronze, Late Bronze, Iron Age 2, all that kind of stuff. So, continuing our journey backwards in time, is that Israel's time in Egypt was 430 years. I have covered this topic in depth. I know there's other textual variants out there, and some things might be footnoted in your Bibles about 215 versus 430. I get into the weeds of everything in there, the contextual ones, the textual ones, the whole 9 yards. So it's 430 at the end of the day. So when you add that on to 1446, you get 1876 when Jacob took the caravan down into Egypt. Next step to get back to Babel is calculating the call of Abram. Jacob was 130 years old when he entered into Egypt. Isaac had Jacob when he was 60, and Abraham had Isaac 25 years after the call when he turned 100 years old. Thus, we can add 215 years on, and we get to 2091 BC for Abraham's call. The next weedy topic in chronology is discussing when did Abraham was he born? Because if you go read Genesis 11, it says that Terah had him when he was 70. Well, it lists 3 brothers. But then you have to go reconcile that with Acts, and that's what that other video does as well. And long story short is that when you see them reconciled together, is that Abraham was not the firstborn child of Terah. He was the 3rd. So he was born in Terah's 130th year, and his call from God occurred right after his dad died. This is a 60-year difference with moving events back and forward, which is a very big thing in the timeline. Might not seem like it from us, 4,000 years removed from it, but it's a big deal when you're trying to pin down dates of events. This allows us then to freely use the rest of the genealogical birth statements in Genesis 11 from Shem to Abraham to see how many years are between each of them and the major events. Repeating the same process from the entry back to the call is that we work back from the call to Babel. We use the birth references along with an additional 75 years because that's when Abraham was called. And that this adds up to 296 years, giving us a 2387 BC early potential date for when Babel occurred. Who's confused?
The difference between BC and AC.
BC before Christ, AAD, Anno Domini. So, okay, oh, sorry. AC in my chart there, after creation. And so you can work forward in biblical chronology, but you're going to run into a roadblock once the exile happens. At some point, you have to go out and get secular timelines and hook it to basically when the first temple was destroyed under Nebuchadnezzar in 587 BC. And that is a linchpin date. Then once you start there, then you can start working backwards like we're doing right here. But you can't work purely forward in time. And I know some will try to say yes, but you cannot do it because you can't date all the things in the Persian Empire using only the post-exilic books. You can't do it. You can't arrive at Jesus and you can't get to this point. You have to use secular timelines at some point, which is that one. So, does that clear everyone's head up already? No. I get it. You can ask me 1,000 questions after this. I get it. It's a lot to digest. Main thing is, hey, there we go. Okay? We're basically at the 24th century BC, before Christ, 2,400 years before Christ, 4,400 years in our sake. Now, recall that we have about a 70-year Babel window that we created. That's just our own doing. Remember, it's the days of Peleg. It could run a little bit longer, but I'm trying to keep it a little bit within that time. This gives us a 2387 to 2317 span when Nimrod began to build the Tower of Babel. This finalizes the biblical profile for Nimrod and the Tower of Babel. Now, it's time to go outside of the Bible and see if there is a secular figure that matches the descriptions for Nimrod. There's a lot of different proposals out there, and because there's like, hey, this guy has a little similarity here, he has a little similarity there, but there's one that has, man, it's too many touch points to not say, and that is Sargon the Great. Number one, his time frame for ruling falls perfectly within our constructed window for Nimrod and Babel. Next thing to note is that Sargon was not his real name. It was a throne name that he took on. His name broken down means the king is legitimate, the legitimate king. Correct. That's noteworthy because it conveys the idea that he wasn't of royal descent, but he needed to legitimize his claim to the throne. Nimrod, we noted that it means let us rebel. Some scholars will say, well, I think that's it's not a real name, but it's just a title for the collective rebellion, or it's a title that they gave Nimrod since he was the leader of the whole rebellion. I'm sticking with the Bible. It says, hey, that was the sixth child, was his name Nimrod. So in both cases, their names speak of someone who rose to power on their own doing and didn't get the throne because daddy died. The primary sources for Sargon is the Sumerian king Lis, plural. There's multiple of them that have been found. A short birth legend, and archaeological inscriptions and stelas from the Mesopotamian area, the Middle East. The Sumerian king list is just that. It's just a big old list of all the kings that ruled up from the ancient past to about the 18th century BC. There's variations to this, but basically, long story short, they all start off with a bunch of guys ruling many thousands of years, covering either 8 or 10 generations. Anyone want to guess what they say happened after that? A flood wiped out the whole world. Noah was what in the line? In the generation line. Anyone remember? 10th. Then, not coincidentally, humanity is rebooted. And according to the list, the first kingdom is in Kish. Linguistically, Cush and Kish are both constructed with the same two consonants. The debate around the Cush side is what vowel to use, since in ancient Hebrew they did not have vowels. That eventually came into their writing process with vowel pointing and such. So there's a strong potential here that they are referring to the same two, one and the same. Working off of that is that right before Sargon's descriptions in the Sumerian kings list is that it speaks of the throne being moved from Kish to Uruk and then to Agade. These names are the biblical equivalents to Erech and Akkad that we saw with Nimrod. Sargon is described rising up in the ranks. Dad was a gardener. He became king and built Akkad. This is the same description for Nimrod. Building of Akkad is speaking of the Akkadian Empire. The gardener mentioning is similar to who in the Bible story? Who? Noah. After the flood, Noah planted a vineyard. He didn't probably do it by himself. Hey sons, this is the job. We're back to being farmers once again. We got to get the earth going. And that would include Cush, who was the dad of Nimrod. Next, we have the birth legend of Sargon. The earliest tablet found for this one comes in the 8th century BC. The story is crazy similar to Moses, with him being put in a basket of reeds. It's sealed up with some bitumen, and then he's put on the river for safety, and then he's drawn out by royalty and raised up in the palace. Now, if this was in the 8th century BC, maybe they jammed it in there because, hey, we got, all these Israelites telling us about Moses and his, rise to fame and all that kind of stuff. Did they steal that and put it into their story? It's a high potential. This is what they did in the ancient world. They stole each other's stories and swapped out names and swapped out gods and say, oh, I like that one, but it's going to be my God instead of your God. It happens a lot. It says that Sargon, though, goes on here, gets a little more into the real side, I think, that he ruled all the land of the Mesopotamian area, and then speaks of him shattering mighty mountains. When you hear that type of mighty mountain language, you are talking about kingdoms being conquered. He's not out there chiseling away at Everest or anything. The Bible does this as well, too. So the birth legend aligns with Nimrod's description of being a conquering warrior king over the land of Acadia. But I'm pretty sure you're still thinking in your head, I want to see that one particular name, though. Don't worry, we'll get there. The inscriptions for Sargon have been found in Nineveh and other places depicting his conquests. One inscription called the Year Names of Sargon have him taking down city-state kingdoms year by year. The notable one here is Elam, because Elam was the son of Shem. Another conquest inscription speaks of him being the lord of the land. That includes victory over places including Ur. Where did Abraham come from? Ur. Another inscription speaks of how Sargon was given conquest over the territory of Lebanon, Turkey, and Syria, modern-day area, by the god Dagon. A very important set of archaeological tablets, if you get into your chronology side of things, is the Assyrian Babylonian Chronicles collection. This basically covers a very long span of ancient Near East history from the 20th century BC up until like Alexander and into that time frame. And the biggest ones out of here that corroborate the biblical stories is Nebuchadnezzar's conquests and sieges of Jerusalem. The 19th Chronicle has a few lines on Sargon. It reiterates that him being a cupbearer, don't take that as a slam, like, hey, go fill up my cup, waiter. Cupbearer was also who? Joseph in Egypt, which is the number 2 rank in the kingdom here. And line 48 says that the god Marduk, that's their biggest god, gave him rule over the entire world. Now, if you're not sitting up and leaning in yet, kind of like, geez, Brad, lean in forward on this one here, because lines 50 and 51 of the tablets say, he, Sargon, dug soil from its pit. In front of Akkad, he built a city which he named Babylon. That doesn't give you a little goosebumps? I don't know, but Chronicle 20 says that Sargon brought all the lands under his authority after this. Line 18 says that Sargon dug up the dirt of the pit of Babylon and made a counterpart of Babylon next to the capital, Akkad. So if you stare at that for a little bit and you just think about what was just being said there, what does he mean about Babylon here? There was a first Babylon, and it got destroyed. Sargon leaves, establishes the kingdom in Akkad, and builds a new Babylon to reminisce about the old one that got taken out. This chronicle goes on about surrounding groups that tried to now attack Sargon. They're probably getting sick of him conquesting everything. But he kept defeating them, and then eventually over the time, it says that the god Marduk took him out because he was displeased with him. That's just how the ancient world saw things. If a king died, the gods saw it in their favor to get rid of him. If they got the throne, the gods put him in place. It was always a very God-thinking oriented, that they were in total control. They were very predestinationists in the ancient Near East, excluding Israel. So collectively, Sargon's profile totally lines up with Nimrod's. Now, are they 100% identical to one another? No, that's not going to happen. But are the descriptions of when, where, what in sync with one another? Yes. But I'm sure someone is asking, yeah, but what about the tower? Where's the tower at? Well, that takes us to part 4. What Nimrod built was a ziggurat, a step pyramid, where at the top of the temple is where people, typically the priests, would go up there and do their sacrifices, prayers, and associate with the gods in their head. Ancient ziggurats are still around in the world today. Probably the most famous one that most can recognize is the one in Mexico for the Mayan period. In Mesopotamia is that there's been a ziggurat unearthed in biblical Uruk, dating back to the 4th century BC. The biggest excavated one dates back to 2100 BC in which again, where was Abraham called out of? Anybody remember when his date for his call was? 2091 BC. As far as the identification for the Tower of Babel, is that located in the Louvre Museum in Paris, a tablet inscribed by Nebuchadnezzar, describing the temple Etemenanki of Babylon. The pictorial description here shows Nebuchadnezzar standing by a ziggurat. An inscription has Nebuchadnezzar describing how he was repairing the Tower of Babylon and the Tower of Borsippa, which is just 11 miles away from Babylon. He says that they were built by a former king. He says that he wanted to finish the top as it had been in ancient times. Nebuchadnezzar is not speaking of some recent tower. He's speaking of long before this. Genesis 11:3 said they used baked bricks at that time. I'm sure when you're reading stories that sometimes you're like, all right, whatever. Right? That's my experience. It's not a throwaway line. Because Nebuchadnezzar's dad, Nabopolassar, said that when he began reconstructing the temple, is that he used numerous baked bricks to repair it. He wants to restore it back to the original. Nebuchadnezzar, on another inscription, names Etemenanki and calls it the ziggurat of Babylon to reach to heaven, being made of bitumen and bricks. The very name Etemenanki means the house of heaven and earth. Genesis 11:4, let us build a city and a tower to reach heaven. The descriptions of where and what are identical. Nimrod's, i.e. Sargon's, aim was to gain access to the spiritual realm. He's not trying to break through the atmosphere and reach Mars, the moon. No. Related to the Tower of Babel story is Jacob's dream of angels ascending and descending out of heaven in Genesis 28. And he says that he saw Yahweh standing on the top, which Jesus equated himself to in John 1:51 as the one who Jacob saw. It's a very clear statement that Jesus just said, I am God. So, Nimrod builds a massive ziggurat to try and gain access to heaven. He's trying to bust through the spiritual world. But what happens next in the biblical story? Genesis 11:7. Come, let us go down and confuse their language so they won't be able to understand each other. Which begs the question, are there any Mesopotamian area stories that align to this? Yep. The story called Enmaker and the Lord of Arata, dating to 2100 BC, basically the time of Abraham. It says that the whole universe spoke in one language until a god named Enki came down and changed the speech in their mouths, which brought contention amongst mankind. If you have contention amongst people, that always breeds what? Violence. Violence breeds splitting apart, i.e. scattering apart, which is exactly what occurs after the failed Babel rebellion. The fact that the ancient Near East name places across the Middle East, Northeast Africa, and Asia Minor, including Southern Europe, match the very names of the sons of Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and the descendants. It's not coincidental. Even the course of history testifies to Noah's pronouncement in 9:26-27 that Japheth will be enriched in dwelling in the tents of Shem, speaking to the covenants of Shem, because Shem is the messianic line, which ultimately leads to who? Christ. Japheth is kind of seen as the European descendant line, and they're always hanging out with the Shemites, ultimately Abraham's covenant, David's covenant, Christ. So all of Genesis 10's and 11's descriptions of Nimrod and the tower do have archaeological evidences to back them up on the who, what, when, where, why, and how. That's everything. Whether a person wants to accept that or not, it's probably the difference between a person being a believer or not. This whole thing slingshots us right back to the book of Acts, with the nations being called back into the family of God, starting at Pentecost when we saw all the list of names, the dispersed nations, the dispersed Jews that were living out in these nations. But then recently we saw full Gentile inclusion being talked about in Acts 10. This is the backdrop and mentality that Paul has when he begins his missions of going out into the nations to spread the gospel, because he's spreading the message that God is bringing back the nations all under him. Reminder, hit the subscribe button below, turn on the notification bell, hit the like button, and leave a comment. And don't forget to visit us at justscripture.org. But in the meantime, stay salty.